Hello and welcome to the Research Connection podcast, the show that brings current expertise and cutting-edge research and connects it with users in the community.
You all want to take a minute to introduce yourselves?
So I am Natashalee Thompson, a recent graduate from Brandon University. So I recently completed my Master of Education degree in Education Administration.
Well, I'm Barb Perry. I'm at Ontario Tech University, and for many years, almost 30 years now, I have studied hate crime and more recently right-wing extremism.
I'm Jackie Kirk. I am the Chair of Leadership and Educational Administration in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University. Michelle.
Thanks, Jackie. I'm Michelle Lamb. I'm the other co-host of the podcast, and I'm the Director of the Center for Aboriginal and Rural Education Studies in the Faculty of Education at Brandon University. And I'm interested in this topic because my dissertation is a case study of newcomer integration in Brandon. And there's a thread of racism and racist experiences running through the whole dissertation. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot from all of you.
Did you see the Moonshot Report? They had recorded searches, online searches for, right-wing extremist sites and terms and all of that, and found like 300% increase in some different kinds of searches. And
and they looked at location for those searches, or
it was by city, and they even got it down to area code, where there was a lot of activity. So whether it was one person, doing a lot, or whether there's a little sort of network of some sort in those areas. Yeah, really, it was quite scary, because some of it was, things like how to join the KKK, and that sort of thing, how to build a bomb. So these were not benign searches. Yeah.
I'm always curious about the prairie provinces and whether they're different in some way.
Yeah, pretty quiet. Saskatchewan and Manitoba have been really quiet. Yeah, especially relative to Alberta, which is just, So it's interesting because you probably know Saskatchewan was really sort of the homeland of the KKK for the longest time, and we do see some glimmerings of a modern KKK movement out there, but not a whole lot. So
and things like Colton Boushie and like those kind of incidents.
Yeah,
those are rural places, rural incidents, right? So I'm always
in the rural areas, it's, and I used to say this about down east, but down east has really changed in the last few years, that, they didn't really need a movement, a far right movement, because
I see. No one needs to know how to Google.
It was so, sort of the racism was so endemic in those communities that, that was sort of normative.
Or in the case of where I grew up, there wasn't any racial diversity, none.
Well, but that's the irony, right? You don't need diversity for people to be hateful.
But on the other hand, I think I grew up without seeing any of that hate too. Because it wasn't in my school. And so, I knew exactly where there was a First Nations family that lived, but they were like 110 miles away.
Oh, wow.
And so we'd see them playing outside when we went to the city, and my parents would say, that's the house. But then they didn't sort of give us any perspective of how we should think about that. And they always had dogs, and they always had bikes, and the kids were always outside, and it looked like a lot of fun to me. I didn't have a picture of or that they lived in poverty, or I didn't have any of those pictures because I had no reference point.
Yeah. Well, the difference now is that everybody does get those pictures, right?
Yeah.
Just right here.
Yeah, exactly.
So,
and then the other thing was that if there were other non-white families in my community, they were usually the doctor's kids, and they had status.
Yeah.
And so then we all wanted to play with them, and we all wanted to be friends with them. I always feel like I don't have the background, so it's hard for me to know the issue. I feel more and more I get to have had more experience, but for a long time I felt like I really needed to step aside because I wasn't a person who had any implicit understanding or experience, and I always sort of wished and feared for getting a job in a community where there would be a high Indigenous population. Wished because I knew that that was a marketable skill, and feared because I had no idea.
Yeah, you didn't have the tools to, yeah.
Okay, so I just want to start by saying, when I did my introduction, I didn't talk to you about my connections to the topic, but I talked a little bit when we were talking before about being from a small town in rural Saskatchewan where there really wasn't any racial diversity. And I feel like since then, I've been trying to catch up to the rest of the world in understanding who we are as Canadians and who we should be as Canadians. And I am forever searching through this topic and trying to talk to people who can teach me, and trying to listen and trying to be open, and always shocked and appalled at the things that I don't know and the things that I make assumptions about. And so I'm really excited about today's podcast because I think I am the one that will do the learning again, and I'm the one that needs to do the learning again. And so welcome everyone. I guess along that same line, we keep hearing that Canada is so much better than the US and so less racist. And I know that that's an assumption. I would go one step further and say that I also make the assumption that the East in Canada has more racism, especially Black racism, than the West. And so I think assumptions are where we get in trouble and where we need to start holding the mirror up for each other. So welcome everyone. Talk to me about those regional assumptions that we make about each other and that as Canadians we have made about the United States, and how much validity is there? What can we learn from talking about it?
Yeah, several pieces in there that could be unpacked, I think. I did, I was in the States for 12 years. So, I've sort of got that point of comparison. My husband's American as well. So, and there is a difference between the way that racism manifests. I mean, both countries are rife with systemic racism, which is not what people think of when they think about racism. They think about individuals, right? They don't really think about those structural forms. And I think that's one of the first steps, and certainly what we're hearing a lot about in the context of the protests we're seeing across the world right now is to pay attention to that. But I think that it also is the case that Canadian racism is a little more subtle. There are people who say, I prefer American style racism because it's in your face and you know where it is. Whereas here, it's sort of polite and coded sort of racism that people often experience. Again, that's systemic. We're very careful. We're polite anyway, right? Now that is an assumption we all make, a stereotype we all have of Canadians, but there's some legitimacy to that. I think some credibility that we're fearful of giving offense in many respects. So I think we're a little quieter in our racism. We reserve it for behind closed doors and aren't nearly as public with it, I think. And in terms of regional differences, that's a really tough one. What we often see, if we look at public opinion polls, for example, is Quebec rising to the top in terms of sort of the proportions that have negative sentiments towards a whole array of communities, as well as Alberta. Those are the two provinces that tend to really to rank high. Do we call it high? That are problematic in terms of those polling results.
And I could add to that to say, I do understand that, and I often hear that too, that assumption that, Canada is much better in terms of racism. But I believe that our focus should shift from the assumption to the fact that it is happening within both countries. And once it's happening, it's not okay. It's not okay, and I do not believe that we should quantify it to say, okay, it might be more there or less here. The fact is that people are being marginalized and oppressed because of colonialism that has allowed to continue in contemporary society. I believe that we need to bring back the focus to the issue and not necessarily the assumption, because while we are acting on those assumptions, we are ignoring the issue that we currently face as countries.
I just wanted to add that both of those things that you raised, the sort of, well, we're not as bad as another region or another country, or that idea of, well, look how far we've come, right? Both of those serve as kind of detours around the topic, right? And I'm curious about what those do to the conversation, that if you're heading down this path of recognizing the issue, and then suddenly you take a detour and say, well, it's not as bad as, or, well, it used to be worse than it is.
Yeah, because it allows, and this is, it allows us to go one step further and say it's not a problem anymore. And I think that that's, we are so complacent as Canadians that we think that, because we have a multiculturalism policy and because we have, all kinds of programs around that somehow we are post-racial, that we have overcome all of those problems, or at least, we're trying really hard. It lets us off the hook. It absolutely does, right? It means that we don't have to do the hard labor anymore.
Or the local version is, but look, we have a multicultural festival.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's wonderful, but that's not a substitution for racial equity.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, okay, you have a festival, but how's your law enforcement treating people of different racial heritages? How are your schools teaching about race? How are they teaching about colonialism, about the Indigenous experience, all of those sorts of things? So yeah, those are the questions you need to sort of come back to them with.
What is shaping the current climate in which hate flourishes? So what are the factors that are affecting this whole discussion?
Well, I really don't know, but apparently we as a society allowed our history to pretty much define our present context, which is pretty much unfortunate. Like, I often think about that question too, to say, why are people in 2020, treating fellow human beings the way they are doing? Like, I cannot find an answer to that. So then we think about the primary institutions of socialization. Are these institutions failing us as a society? Because I believe this is behavior that is learned over time. And it goes back to the home, the school, the church, all those social institutions that are supposed to help us in terms of preparing us for adulthood and for the future. So I believe that we need to revisit those institutions that transit certain norms and values into children, who in turn, go on into adulthood with these, I guess, misconceptions about people, in the sense that, you have a race that is inferior and a race that is superior, because it is a message that has been transmitted over time.
I'm sort of interested in that perspective, Natashalee. As an educator, I understand that education is often used as a tool by the society to promote the political perspectives of the society at the time. And as we look back, we can see so many mistakes that we've made and so much harm that we've done as educators. I worry and wonder, what is it that I'm being asked to promote now that we're going to look back on in 50 years and go, oh, that was horrible. I'm really, I can't quite get over that. I keep thinking about residential schools and the fact that my profession really caused so much harm, when most teachers really are in it to do good, are in it to build people up. And it was a destructive force in our society, and we're still feeling the effects of it.
And I think, I mean, we're seeing it now, sort of the continuation of that in the silence, you know, across curricula across the country, that you know, don't spend a lot of time talking about our colonial history, don't spend a lot of time talking about the residential schools, all of those sorts of pieces. You know, we're trying to indigenize the curriculum now. You know, that also implies that we have, you know, that teachers have the capacity to have those conversations with their kids. You know, whether we're talking about that or whether we're talking about, you know, oppression of immigrants, those are difficult conversations for which not everyone is necessarily equipped. So a good example, we had a few years back, I had students in one of their capstone courses developing interventions against, sort of to inoculate against right-wing extremism amongst youth. So they developed workshops for grade 11, you know, grade 10, 11, 12 students, and delivered them in half a dozen schools in our region. And it was, you know, it was really interesting when they came back and said, you know, well, the kids said, I had no idea, I didn't know, you know, I didn't know if these things existed. But what was of more concern were the teachers saying the same thing. So in the midst of the rise in the right, the teachers aren't equipped to have those conversations. And so if the teachers, you know, don't have that awareness, that understanding, how are we going to, you know, sort of inoculate our kids against it? Yeah.
Natashalee, have you had those conversations with your kids? I have had them with mine. My kids are biracial, and we've had the conversation about, you know, they're young, so we phrase it in ways that they can understand, but some people might treat you differently. Some people might not like you, and it's not your fault. But I'm curious if you've also been having those conversations in your house.
Yes, definitely, because so my older boy, unfortunately, he had experienced racism at school, which is very unfortunate. And so it took a point in terms of supporting him emotionally, to say, just for him to pull on that inner strength, because that's important. And I guess that's how we persevere given all that is happening around us. So it's to say, okay, I am special, you know, I have a purpose. So it's just like those affirmations to say, you know, I am worthwhile, I can do this, I am resilient, you know, despite all the odds, you know, that is happening. So it's just that, to pull on that inner strength. So each time, you know, this is happening and it's very difficult, but then you can say, okay, this does not make me less than a human being because this is happening. You know, I am here for a reason, I am purpose, I am going to do well at school and move on and try to move on. But it's hard because they're kids and they don't really know to navigate that. You can imagine you're trying to play and another kid is going to say, I'm not going to play with you because you're too brown, you know? So those things are heartbreaking, but it happens. And that is where the support is needed to kind of get him to move forward, you know? But it's extremely difficult. It's extremely difficult. And when your heart is just tied up in that with all those emotions, it makes it even, you know, more heartbreaking. But as educators, it is important in terms of what we're teaching and the type and the history as it relates to our teaching. Because sometimes, for example, I am from Jamaica, and European history tells a different story as opposed to Caribbean history, and how we choose to impart that information. You know, it's critical to how our students, because their minds, they're small and we're molding, we're shaping them. So whatever they take in is pretty much what they're going to let out. So that is why these social institutions are very, very important.
Yeah, I see a big, like what Barb was saying earlier about how teachers don't necessarily feel equipped to be able to have those conversations or to be able to teach that knowledge. If those conversations are happening in homes, then that really shows the need to be able to draw on parents of color, immigrant parents, Indigenous parents, as a source of strength and a source of knowledge for the whole classroom, and to be able to strengthen those connections, particularly when we have a teaching profession that's largely white, right?
Definitely.
And that circles us right back to the systemic pieces, right?
Yes.
But I think I took us off track. I really wanted to hear Barb's answer too. Sorry, Jackie.
Me too.
I wanted to hear about what shapes the climate in which hate flourishes from your perspective, Barb.
Sure. Well, yeah, as Natashalee put it so eloquently, it is in our history, right? I mean, we are founded in that notion of white supremacy and the subjugation of the indigenous population, and then after that, the Black population in terms of slavery. So we carry all of that with us. But in the more immediate context, it's sort of been a perfect storm over the past 5 or 6 years. We like to lay the blame squarely at Trump's feet in terms of normalizing the kind of hatred that we're seeing now, the rise of the right, all of that. And he has certainly, through his explicit discourse, sort of continued to vilify Muslims and immigrants and Latinos and Black people and, anyone who does not look like him. But we've had our own, talking about key institutions, right? Political leaders and administrations that have played the same kinds of games, especially around immigration, especially around Muslims. So we have that emboldening the far right, and then to bring it to sort of even more immediate than that. On top of all of that, we layer on COVID now, and how that has been exploited by the far right to again place the blame on Jews. It's a Jewish conspiracy. Place the blame on the Chinese. It's a Chinese conspiracy. It's a bioweapon. All of those pieces are also feeding into sort of this wave of xenophobia and hatred directed towards a whole array of communities. And now, after not just one murder, but several murders of Black and Indigenous people in the past couple of weeks, at the hands of law enforcement, and the protests are also being exploited by the far right to say, look, there they go again, sort of thing. But also they are acting as provocateurs at some of the protests, as we've seen. They've been provoking violence and engaging in violence themselves in order to discredit the movement as well. So there are all of these processes coming together. And I think then, let's look at another layer in there. And I think this is especially the case in the West, where there's so much anxiety in the past, well, there always is, but in particular the past couple of years, 3 or 4 years, around the risk to the energy sector and especially the oil industry, and the sort of economic anxiety that's causing. So again, looking for scapegoats there, close the borders so that we don't have the sort of competition. And again, COVID has added another layer to that in terms of lost jobs, lost businesses. So there are multiple and overlapping processes, I think, at work here.
So that's leading to lots of individuals and organizations who are standing up and making a commitment to publicly, to equity, to diversity, to anti-racism. Is that going to make a difference? Are we going to see change evolve out of this perfect storm, as you call it?
Well, is there anything new in those promises that we haven't heard before? That whether it's businesses saying they're going to enhance their diversity hiring, or they're going to look more closely at their policies and measure them for systemic discrimination. We've certainly heard it from provincial and federal leaders before. Ontario's a good example of how the whim of a government can shape the direction that we take in that area. Under the last administration, there was a strategic plan on racism and anti-Black racism especially. And it was sort of, and there was a anti-racism directorate established, and all of that has been pretty much laid to rest under the current administration. And even now, there are calls to resuscitate that in light of the protests and the demands for equity. And there aren't even promises being made that there are plans afoot to, sort of bring it back to life. We have a federal, when was that introduced? 6-8 months ago, a federal action plan on racism. And, it's a nice piece of paper, but where's the funding? Where are the programs? Where are the real initiatives on the ground that have the capacity to even touch, whether it's anti-Indigenous or anti-Black or anti-Asian, whatever the case may be. So I think there continues to be a lot of empty rhetoric.
Perfectly put, Barb, because if we have all these on paper, they become empty gestures without the action to support these initiatives. So if it is that these systems that are on paper are not being supported, then it means we're basically back to where we have started years ago. Because if you look at it now, we do not have a set of laws for Black people and a set of laws for white people. We have laws on paper that should ensure, equity, but then persons who are supposed to ensure that equity and justice are not necessarily doing that. Because if you look at law enforcement who are supposed to ensure that, these fairness is consistent for everyone, it is not being done. So not until we change the systems that are in place that are oppressing persons and marginalizing people based on race, then we won't see a change. I think we have to start small. So as individuals, we need to confront our own biases, because at the end of the day, it's people like us who are in these positions of power and who should ensure that persons really get the justice that they should, and based on what is written in terms of laws and policies. So we have to start small, confronting our own biases, looking in our workplace, looking at our homes, see what we can do. And, and I think it will just build up in terms of a ripple effect, just, reflecting and just going forward. So we have to start small and get bigger, because I think we have, as you clearly outlined, we have those policies in place, which is big in terms of political, it's at that level. But then the other actions that are needed to support these policies are not in place. It's in the schools, it's in the health institutions, social services institution. So not until we try to eliminate those before we can really move forward to say that this is a change that we are going to support, and we're going to do everything that we can to support this change. We are all one, and I believe that's a good way in terms of moving forward.
Yeah, Natashalee, you also acknowledge that change has to happen at a number of levels. I mean, the individual, the organizational, and the structural as well, and they build on one another. I mean, sometimes we do need policy change and legislation to change behavior. It might not change attitudes right away, but it will change our behavior. So, it does need to occur there. When I did a lot of work with PFLAG, PFLAG, Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays, I did a lot of education for them. And one of the things that I would share, especially with workplaces, were some assessment forms. So there was an individual assessment to assess your own biases, as you were referring to, and where you held stereotypes, where you held biases, all that sort of thing. But I also provided them with organizational assessments as well, sort of checklists, if you will, as a means of, sort of assessing their policy base, whether it was around hiring and promotion or pay or training or whatever the case may be. And organizations found that really helpful. So there you're working at the individual level, but also at that organizational level. And that can filter in, depending on the workplace, right? It can filter up to the next level. So it's, it's sort of both directions, right? From the bottom up and from the top down. And we need to be coming at it from all of those directions.
Okay, so Barb, I'm going to keep you talking. You are working on these hard issues in a number of different capacities, like with a number of different issues. How do you care for yourself in all of that?
I'm supposed to do that?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think not very well. I think one of the things that sort of is a buffer for me is that I'm, in spite of all the work that I do, I'm a very positive person. I'm a very upbeat person. I'm always smiling. And I think that just that part of my nature helps me through. And I'm much better, as all of us are, I think, in the summer. In the winter, I'm a gardener, so, I live for the summer when I can be outside, and that's really my therapy is to, I was raised on a farm. You could hear my brother's tractor in the background. He picks today to start baling or cutting the hay outside the cottage. Yeah, so I was raised on a farm, so it's in my genes, and it really is therapeutic for me to grow something. So even in the winter, I start my seeds early, and that's a distraction for me, and that's the way that I self-medicate, if you will, with earth, and that really, I think, that sort of inner joyfulness that I have by nature, and that kind of mindless release almost of gardening is that does it for me. I don't have kids to sort of pour my energy into and find joy in. I do get some of that from my family. So, and I'm sure all of you are finding what a challenge it is, in lockdown, maybe too much family. In my case, it's not enough family because, I can't see my brother and my sister and my nieces. So that's been a bit of a challenge, but aren't we lucky to at least be locked down in an era of Zoom and Skype and all of these other pieces that keep us connected?
Yes.
Yeah. So relationships are also, I think, very important to keeping me grounded and keeping me sane. Yeah.
Thank you. That's good. Natashalee, would you like to add anything to that question?
For me, it's a lot of inner strength. And just telling myself that I am going to do it. For me, life has never been easy. So I've always been breaking down barriers, So it kind of become a part of me to say that if I need to get something done, like I am going to do, it's just trying to hold on to the values that you have. In terms of self-care, my children, they're very therapeutic. And just knowing that you are trying to provide a better life for them, or, it helps you, it keeps you going despite all the negative happenings, and remaining positive is important. Because if every day you wake up saying something bad is going to happen, then more than likely that's where your mindset is. So mindset is important. So you have to wake up being positive, saying, okay, this is happening, but a change is going to come, or look at the positive, look at the peaceful protests, look at other people standing with us, fighting for this cause too, because they realize that, we have been marginalized and we have been negatively affected over the years. So despite the negative happening, like I just try to find at least one positive out of it, to say, okay, this is what I am going to hold on to and help this to push me forward. So, and again, it's challenging. And I do have some people believe I'm really strong, but I do have my points, my low points. But, when I think about like the positive, like it just drives me. And for me, a lot of my processing takes place in my head because I'm always busy. So I kind of give myself that self-talk, in my head, in my thoughts, to say, okay, this is what I'm going to do. This is what I'm going to hold on to. This is what I'm going to allow to shape me, to shape my day, and just try and move forward. And just hopefully if something unexpectedly happens, then you try to deal with it as it comes and just try to see the positive out of it.
Michelle?
For me, I feel like I struggle in this area. I'm more sensitive than I need to be sometimes. And so if I'm doing some work and someone doesn't like it, or I hear something negative in response to something I've done, I take it personally, and it takes me a long time to be okay again. And it's something I'm working on. I feel like my family helps, my community helps, but I have to, it takes a few days for me to kind of come back to, okay, this is what I'm doing, this is why. And I also realize there's immense privilege in that I can shut my laptop and it all goes away, right? I don't go outside on the street and encounter the same levels of racism that Indigenous or people of color would encounter just in everyday life. And so I feel like that's a point of privilege too, that I can shut it down and take a few days if I need to kind of recover from some hurtful comments or something like that. And not everyone can do that. And so I recognize that that's privilege, but I also feel like it's really an area that I want to work on.
Yeah, but it will hurt because, it's hard because we have emotions and that's a part of dealing with it too. It's not like it affects us, like it affects me. Yeah. But it's just, and like, I cannot ignore that, but it's just the way to not allow it to consume you totally, where it becomes so detrimental to your health and well-being, and that's where as people of color, we need to pull on that inner strength to be resilient. Because when we allow other people to see us as in being weak, like, I guess that's what the oppressor wants us to be, weak. But you have to kind of push back and say, no, I'm going to stand, I am going to fight, I am going to be strong. And yes, we are hurting, but it's just trying to, put up that resistance to say, I am not going to fall and die. I'm going to stand and say, no, this is not right. You should not be doing this to us. And there's a better way. Treating us with respect and dignity does not mean that you're not going to be treated with respect and dignity.
The issues do get me down, and I get really down on myself about the assumptions. Like when I talked at the beginning about the assumptions, with the George Floyd case specifically, I'm passed it by without paying attention to what the news story was about because it was US news. And I get really depressed about the US news because I see so many people being hurt. And so I had passed it by, but one of my best friends is Black, and he phoned and said, did you see that story? And I said, well, I don't know. I'm not paying attention to what happens in the States. And then I had to live with the fact that it had really hurt him and I hadn't paid attention. And that was like, when Michelle talked about closing her laptop and having it gone, then I recognized, oh, that's all about my privilege. And I have the privilege of saying, no, that's just another US story. And yeah, it does take self-care because despite the fact that I make assumptions, I'm a person who cares deeply about the people around me. And I take it pretty hard that when I recognize those pieces, that hurts, that I wasn't that good. But it's also a good mirror because then I can grow from that. But yeah, then I go back to my being outside, being with my dogs, being in my garden. Those are the places that I sort of get to grow again, come back. So thank you very much for being with us. And I really appreciate that both of you took the time to spend with us this afternoon. So thanks a lot.
Yeah, well, thanks for facilitating the conversation. It's an important one to have right now.
Thank you for listening to the Research Connection podcast. You can visit our website for links to everything that was mentioned in the episode. And for more Research Connection content at www.brandonu.ca/bu-cares. Be sure to rate and subscribe so you can stay up to date with current research that impacts your community. Thank you.